All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first session of the 54th Annual Gatlinburg Conference. My name is Jen Humphrey, and on behalf of the Lifespan Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome Maggie Koerth, who is a KU alumna and award-winning journalist. I want to give you a little bit of housekeeping first. We have more than 200 participants for this session, so we have disabled chat, but we do encourage you to leave questions in the Q&A box that's available at the bottom of your screen. And we'll also try to get to as many of those questions as we can before the session fully concludes by 1:15. Of course, we also want you to know that this session is being recorded. So a little bit about Maggie Koerth. She is a senior science editor at FiveThirtyEight. She was previously science editor at Boing Boing and a monthly columnist for New York Times Magazine. In 2014, she was named a Neiman Berkman Fellow in Journalism Innovation at Harvard University. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine named her a 2017 Communication Award winner. And in 2018, she won the Online Gold Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Kavli Science Journalism Awards. She has also been a contributor to Discover, Popular Science, New Scientist, Scientific American, and National Geographic. Her work covers diverse topics ranging from electric infrastructure to panda sex to COVID-19. Please welcome Maggie Koerth.
Hi, thank you all for being online with me today. It's a very little odd kind of talking to the computer screen, but I trust that you are all there. And if you have questions when we get to the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask them and I will be more than happy to answer. So, like she said, I am a science journalist. I have been doing this job communicating about science for about 20 years now. And I get emails every single day from people who are trying to communicate their science to me. And I want to start off this presentation by sort of showing you guys some examples of what not to do, the really bad communication about science that I get in my email box. Here's one of my favorites. It's science because there's a statistic involved probably, and these are not rare. Another really good one that I got recently, I think is kind of hilarious because it hopes that I am well and then encourages me to get divorced, which you can kind of see on the little arrows that I have pointing here. This third one is a problem because it is basically pseudoscientific wellness product trying to talk me into a thinly veiled advertorial, which is, to put it mildly, not my jam. And my point in showing you these three examples of bad science communication emails that I get is not so much to kind of show you that like some people are bad at this job, but more just to show you that you already know more than you think you do. You're already better at this than you think you are. You're better at this than people who are literally paid to be communicating science every day. There is such a thing in this world as bad attention. And honestly, anybody sending out mass PR emails to journalists is probably not serving themselves very well to begin with. That's because these examples also tell you something else about my job as a journalist, and that's that I get emails every single day, tons of them. My inbox is completely chock full. There is a lot that is vying for my attention. There's a lot that's vying for everybody's attention. And that presents a question. How do you make your work interesting and accessible? How do you get in front of the right people, in front of the right journalists? I know that you guys are all smart enough not to spam me with invitations to National Margarita Day, but that doesn't mean that you know exactly what to do instead. So I'm going to walk you through 5 steps that'll help. And the first thing, I promise, is super, super, super simple. And that is making yourself easy to find on the internet. This is a thing that you would think would be pretty obvious, but has not always been in my experience with scientists. So what I do when I'm working on a story, I come up with a topic that I want to research. And I end up having to kind of go around and figure out who I need to talk to. This is not always completely obvious. I start with looking on Google Scholar for who's been writing about this topic recently, but I also end up doing a lot of just kind of Googling around for researchers and research centers that cover these kind of topics, whatever topic it is I'm working on. And sometimes I find people who are really easy to reach, and sometimes I don't. And it really depends, it seems to depend a lot on how people have their website set up. And if I can't get in touch with you, then neither can anybody else. So these are the things that you absolutely need to have as a researcher on your website. I need to know what your specific research interests are. It doesn't do me a lot of good to find a website that is, say, for autism research. This person does autism research, but if there's a specific thing that you do and it's not listed, I might end up contacting you and wasting your time, bothering you with questions that you can't answer. It's a lot more easy for you and for me if you have your specific research topics listed there on your page. It's also really helpful if you have links to the research papers that you've written recently. Even better if I can download those PDFs, because journalists do not always have access to journal subscriptions to get a hold of your articles. Sometimes we are going to need to get the PDFs directly from you. And if your most recent stuff is available right on your site, that'll help us do a better job of knowing what questions to ask you, knowing whether you're the right person to contact, all of that kind of good stuff. This is, I think, important because it's sort of an example of how public communication doesn't even have to be active. It can be a passive thing. It's not necessarily that you're even doing all that much. It's just that you're making yourself available. You're creating the space where you can end up in somebody's list of experts to contact. And that sets you off on the right path to communicating with journalists, to communicating with the general public, to communicating with other researchers who, you may not actually be in contact with. But this then means that there's an active part of communication, speaking for yourself. I hate to say this, but you do not actually need me. You are completely capable of talking about your own work. And I might not actually be the best way for you to get your material out there. We're going to talk about more about that later, but basic thing you need to know right now is that journalists don't always have the same goals that you do. There are a lot of ways that you can communicate your work your own way, get out exactly what you need to get out. So I want to tell you about some ways that other people are communicating their own science. Twitter is obviously something you've heard of. It's been around for a long time. And it's a really, really great way to get your expertise out there, to make a name for yourself. Part of what makes it a really good place to do that is that Twitter is an ecosystem that is full of journalists. If you want to be in contact with the media, with the press, if you want to be known as somebody who can talk about your work through the lens of whatever is going on in the news that day, Twitter is a great place to be. It's a place that you can kind of make short, pithy statements, tie your work into the news, tie your work into breaking things, and the journalists will see you. The journalists can see you. It's a place where you can go to sort of find us. It's kind of our water cooler at this point. And that's a really good resource for you to know about. Now, it helps, of course, if you can be succinct. If you can't be succinct, that is where blogs come in. Now, I would have had very different advice for you 10 or 15 years ago about blogging. There was a lot of science blogging happening back then, and a lot of scientists communicating their work in individual blogs. And those blogs were getting a lot of attention from readers, from the press. A lot of that has changed. And at this point in the game, I would not really recommend you spending a lot of time establishing your own separate, distinct blog. But the good news is that there are still platforms out there where you can write a blog post when you need to, but you don't have to spend tons of time trying to build your own audience or trying to post often enough that people actually pay attention to what you're doing. That just takes up so much of your time. And there's not a lot of good ways now that, with the loss of RSS feeds and blog rings and things like that, there's not a lot of good ways that people are necessarily discovering your work. So what I would recommend instead, if what you want to write is something more in depth, if you want to write about a specific paper of yours, and you want to get that knowledge out into the public, is something like a blog like The Conversation, which is a publication that publishes the writings of scientists directly on a whole bunch of different topics. And it's a place that readers, that the press, that politicians know to go to for that kind of content. So you don't need to build the audience. You just have to provide the content. And that's a really, really great place to do that. I've also seen people doing really fun things on more experimental type of social media like TikTok. There are a lot of different scientists. It's not just dances. It's not just silly teenager things. There are a lot of scientists and historians and artists doing these short little videos where you can get creative, you can draw art, you can talk really fast at the camera about things that you're excited about in your field. And they are getting a lot of viewership. They're getting their ideas out there. TikTok actually turns out to be a really, really great place for mental health fields in particular, because a lot of the people watching these videos are interested in things like trauma, like learning, like disability. There's a lot of that interest in those kind of issues happening on TikTok. It just takes a little bit of experimenting to sort of figure out what works and what doesn't in that venue. Podcasts are also a really good place to go. There are a lot of podcasts that are sort of science inside baseball, but that have simultaneously managed to become popular outside of just this tiny little niche. And I think a really good example of that is something called This Week in Virology, which when I first started listening to it 10 years ago, was a very, very niche show that I did not expect to end up with a listenership that went beyond actual virologists, but it has, because they have figured out how to have conversations that get in depth into their work in a way that a regular newspaper or magazine might not be able to, but they're able to do that in a way that's conversational and a way that draws in listeners from all over the place. And then there's even more weird things that you can do. One of my favorite ways that I've ever heard of people getting their research out there was when a bunch of astronomers got themselves set up at music festivals in England, and basically were going around from tent to tent at these camping festivals telling people about astronomy that they could see literally above their heads. There's lots of these interactive, interesting ways that you can make your research your own thing to talk about without having to go through a journalist. One of the keys to all of these things, though, is that you need to watch before you try. Back in the early days of the internet, we used to say lurk more. And I think that is still really good advice, because it's sitting around and watching what other people are doing, sitting on these platforms, participating in these platforms as part of the audience, that you start to learn what the norms are, that you start to get an idea of what your content should look like and how you can communicate that content better. The nice thing about all of this, though, is that you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel. There are whole peer-reviewed research papers, as you can see from my citation here, that will show you how to use Twitter. There are best practices. We know what works and what doesn't. This is stuff that people have been working on for a really long time, and you can take advantage of that. You don't have to go out and start all of this from scratch. I'm not going to tell you which of these different ideas, which of these different directions you can go is better, because what's better is going to differ for you based on your goals and based on what you actually like doing. I think one of the most important things I can tell people is that you shouldn't do any specific kind of social media, any specific kind of communication because you feel like you have to. You should do it because that's what works for you. That's what works with your personality. All of these different things, whether it's podcasting, whether it's TikTok or Twitter, or showing up in person at live events, all of those things, your trustworthiness is based on your authenticity. And your authenticity is based on whether people can tell that you like doing this and that you understand it and that you don't feel like you're being forced into doing it. So starting from that perspective is important. And I think that with that caveat, all of these different things have stuff that ties them together and makes them work. In all of these cases, with all of these different kinds of platforms, you're passively findable. People can stumble across your work. They can find you by searching for information about your field. People ask me sometimes about like whether they need to set up a newsletter. And I actually think that that's not a good way to go because newsletters are not as passively findable. Just like it's hard for people to know you have a blog, and if you're just setting up your own private blog, the same thing is true of your newsletter. If you don't have an audience already, it's really hard to get one just by having a newsletter. Whereas with Twitter, you can follow other people and comment on their work and slowly build up an audience just by people sort of discovering you. All of these different platforms also allow you to interact with the public. They can ask you questions, you can answer, you can make this dialogue that won't happen otherwise outside of a classroom. These formats all also force you to tighten up your message. You can write or create any of these things. You can't write or create any of these things like you do a scientific paper. And that's good because that's not what the public's looking for. And it's really important for you to sort of force yourself to communicate your research and your broader knowledge in these ways that require you to be succinct and require you to speak colloquially. All these platforms also allow you to make connections with other scientists and researchers and build ideas in an interdisciplinary way. I feel sometimes like a huge part of my job as a journalist has been connecting researchers who have been studying the same things or different aspects of the same things and had no idea until they saw themselves in the same story that I wrote. So there's a lot of research probably going on about your field that you don't even know about, and getting on some of these different platforms allows you to learn more. They all also put you in a place to offer your expertise in moments where lots of people are paying attention to your field all at once. You can leverage your deep knowledge basically, and you can leverage it to connect with the news. You can leverage it to connect with a holiday. You can leverage it to connect with back to school. There are reasons why people might be seeking you out, and any kind of these events or social media gives you that opportunity to make these connections. And this stuff really does matter. This paper that I'm giving you a citation here now for showed that articles that were highly tweeted were 11 times more likely to also be highly cited than less tweeted articles. This isn't something where you're just tossing stuff onto the internet and it doesn't really matter. It's not even a situation where it only matters to the public and not to your field. These things are all interconnected. And you don't have to be famous. You don't have to be a Neil deGrasse Tyson or whatever to get value out of this kind of interaction. But to make it work, you do have to tell your story well. And that means learning some important tips about communication, about storytelling. The first one I want to talk to you a little bit about is narrowing it down, limiting the number of ideas that you're communicating at any given time. Now, I know from experience that when you start researching a topic, there feels like there's just an infinite number of things that are important about it and that you feel like you need to get across to people. But any given story that you write, any given blog post, any given speech that you give has to really get down to one or two things that you're trying to get across. I think a good example of this was a story that I wrote a few years ago about panda reproduction. And I spent, 2 years researching this story, had reams and reams of research on panda sex, and was still trying to figure out how to piece all of these different things that I thought were so interesting and I thought were so important into this story. One of these things was this entire side plot about these two different branches of Chinese panda research centers, that it seemed like one of them had a very different approach to animal welfare than another, and how that was affecting overall panda ecology. You know, as pandas were reintroduced and as pandas were associated with humans, these two different branches of the Chinese research centers that were managed by two completely different agencies within the Chinese government made a big difference in how these things played out. But when I sat down to actually write the story, I realized that even though that was important, even though all of that could be a story, it could be a story in and of itself. And it wasn't necessarily part of this narrower piece of information about why panda sex just didn't seem to be working the way everyone expected it to, why pandas weren't reproducing in captivity, or whether, as it turned out, they actually were. Those were two separate things. And I could tell one story without all of the details from the other story. And so I had to let one story go. It had to focus in on just the panda sex. And I had to kind of decide I was going to come back later to the other stuff about these research centers. That's something that you're going to have to do when you are communicating with the public. There will be times that people come to you and say, like, oh, you didn't touch on issue X, Y, and Z. And that's because you can't fit every single issue into every single piece of public communication that you do. Another important thing that you're going to have to learn is that you need to literally tell stories. You need to tell anecdotes. You need to give examples. Those are going to be the things that sort of help people get drawn into your story. And actually, they're the things that help people remember stories. We don't necessarily remember polemic. We don't necessarily remember numbers. We remember narratives. We remember tales. And if we can tie the things that are important into those narratives, we can make them stick in people's memories better. Another thing that's really important is that you need to speak to people the way that you speak to people outside of work. When you're talking to the public, when you're talking to journalists about your research, you can't talk to them the same way that you're expected to talk to your colleagues in a formal setting. You have to use the language that you would use at a dinner party. You have to use the language that you would use to your family. I think one thing that I have found really useful is to sort of think about it like, if you've ever been to the American Association for the Advancement of Science conference, I really like that conference because it is so interdisciplinary. It's researchers from physics, from biology, from psychology, and they all have to come together in a place where they have to talk to each other. And the reality is that when you're that interdisciplinary, you're basically having to talk on the level of lay people, because that biologist does not know all of the technical details of physics. That physicist doesn't know what's happening in your psychology field. And by the time they're talking to each other in a way that these very different unconnected fields can understand, they're also talking in a way that the general public can understand. And they're telling stories that are really great for me to pick up as a journalist. That's the kind of voice, that's the kind of language you need to be thinking about. Not necessarily how you would speak if you're trying to earn the approval of your dean, but how you would speak if you're trying to talk to a friend, if you're trying to talk to your parents. It's also important to not underestimate your audience or yourself. When I say don't underestimate your audience, I mean, you have to simplify, but not because people are dumb. You have to simplify because people don't have a lot of time and they don't necessarily have all of the brain space to remember everything you want to tell them the first time you talk to them. But people are still really smart and people can still make these connections that you might not otherwise ever make. And they'll do that for you if you talk to them in a way that they can understand it. When you're also talking about not underestimating, you shouldn't underestimate yourself, because you exist in this bubble of expertise. And sometimes it's really easy to forget that some of the stuff you think is basic information is brand new to a whole lot of other people. So there are probably things that you don't think people actually want to know or need to know, or that everybody already knows that they don't. And those are things that you can go out into the world and tell them right now. and get lots of excitement and lots of interest in that. I have run into this every time I've done a big project that I come away from, whether it's, PandaSex or in energy infrastructure, I come away assuming people know things that they don't know because I've just heard them 15,000 times already. So the important thing is to sit down and sort of list out what are the basic facts about your field that you know. And then maybe just try talking to your friends and family and find out whether they also know those things, because they might not. And those things could be information that would be useful to them. The fifth thing I want to talk to you about is gossip. But what I mean by that is that you need to make connections between your work and other people's work. That could mean simply telling journalists, simply telling the public, anybody who asks you about your work, about the work of other people that you think is interesting, that you think is related to yours. This is also about remembering that your work is not the only work you can talk about. You can talk about the general state of your field. You can talk about questions in your field that other people are researching. You can talk about studies that you think are really cool that you didn't have anything to do with because you have a way of talking about them. If you have the attention of the public, if you have the attention of a journalist, you should remember that you can talk about people besides yourself. Another big point that I think that you need to know is that if you want to work with other people to communicate your work, if you don't want to just do this yourself, you need to sit back and think about what it is you actually want, what it is you're actually trying to do with your communication before you do it. It's important to know those things because that's the only way that you're going to make good media choices for yourself. You don't have to do all of the communication. You don't have to take up every opportunity you're presented with. You probably don't want to, and you probably don't have time for that. It's really easy to get caught up with media and then end up feeling uncomfortable about what you're doing or what the results of that interview are. And everything is going to work out better if you know what you need, you know what you're trying to get out of it, and you feel like you're taking more control of the situation. The first step in that is knowing what your motivations are. You need to know what your hope is for this communication. Do you want this to be something that just promotes a new article you came out with? Is there some specific idea you're trying to get out into the public? Who is it that you're actually trying to reach? Is there like a specific population of people, or is it everyone? Trying to narrow these things down is really going to help you understand who you need to go talk to, where you need to talk to them, what you need to say to them. You have to ask yourself questions before anybody else can ask you questions. It's also really helpful to know what it is that makes your work important and to realize that you may not be the best arbiter of that. I have run into situations many, many times where a new study has come out and there will be a press release that says, okay, here's what's important about it. And then I sit down and read the study. And what is interesting to my audience is not necessarily the thing that the research authors thought was important about it. So sitting down and having conversations with people outside your field, having conversations, again, with friends and family, will help you understand what is important to people who are not part of your field necessarily, what is important to these populations you're trying to reach. It's also important to know the people that you're collaborating with. You need to remember that, again, how your work fits in with what's being done by other people in your field is definitely part of what makes it important. And you also need to remember that the reporters, the communicators, the educators, the popularizers, all of those are different people. So when you're talking about who you want to work with, who you want to be communicating your research and who you want to go to, that's a choice. That's not necessarily just go to one place. There are lots of different people doing these jobs and they're doing them from slightly different perspectives. So for instance, a journalist is out there trying to get information to people and ask questions and be critical of scientific research to understand whether the actual reality of what's being communicated is the same as what's actually going on. They're trying to make links between different kinds of research so that they can give people insight into big trends in society. And that's maybe a different point of view that they're going to bring to the situation than somebody like a science educator who is going to be going out with a much less critical lens necessarily, wanting to get scientific information out there, wanting to make sure that the public understands what you want them to understand. Activists are another group that's going to have a completely different perspective and also still be somebody who can help you communicate your work. So what you want ends up relating to who you want to communicate it. And all of that ends up relating to how well you are going to come away from a media experience feeling like you did, feeling like the experience served you or not. Another thing that I want to kind of get into here a little bit is what to expect when you're talking to a journalist. Because like I said, we are a very specific field that has a specific set of rules and ethics, and those are not necessarily intuitive, and they're not necessarily as transparent as they should be. So, as I said before, the goals of a journalist are not necessarily the same as yours. I am not here to make you look good or promote your ideas. I'm here to serve my readers and to help them better navigate important issues that your research might help them illuminate. I think a really good example of this has sort of come up around some of the communication about COVID-19 vaccines. We had a bunch of the public concerned when the data on the J&J, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine first came out, and it sort of looked like it was less effective than Pfizer or Moderna. We as journalists wanted to get into that and help people understand that you can't really compare the effectiveness of those three vaccines because they haven't actually been compared to each other. And the differences between all of the different clinical trials are so big that it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. There's not a clean comparison to be made, so you don't actually know that one works better than the other. But around that time period, a bunch of public health people also started saying that it doesn't really matter whether one is more effective than the other. What matters is that they all are 100% effective at preventing death. And this message kept getting repeated and repeated and repeated by people who are trying to do science communication, by people who are doing popularization of public health, by people who are trying to get a message of trust in vaccines out there. But the reality is that that wasn't exactly an accurate statement, because if you went in and looked at the research, what you would find is that there weren't anybody, if you looked at the actual clinical trials, the number of people who died in the vaccine arm of those trials was 0, but so was the number of people who died in the placebo arm of those trials. So if nobody is dying from COVID-19 in either the placebo or the treatment arm of the trials, we can't really say that the vaccine prevents death at 100%. And journalists, it became our job to sort of go out and tell people, to clarify, like, we don't actually know that that's true yet. And we got pushback from scientists and from science popularizers who felt like we were making the vaccines feel less trustworthy. But it's not necessarily our job to make the vaccines seem trustworthy. It's our job to make sure people clearly understand everything that's going on and aren't being misled. So there are two different goals there, and sometimes they're in conflict, and journalists are going to be not necessarily trying to do exactly what you are trying to do. There are other ways that what journalists are doing are going to differ from what you might expect. If I interview you for a story, you may or may not actually be quoted. You may or may not actually even be mentioned by name. That doesn't mean that what you did wasn't helpful. It doesn't mean that I didn't use your information in the story. It just means there's only so many words I have to work with. And if 5 people are saying the same thing, I'm just going to make a statement of that rather than attributing it to one person. Your title in the story that I write as a journalist is also going to be very simplified. At FiveThirtyEight, our style is to just say that you are a professor of X, whatever your department is. And people often want something a lot more detailed than that. I will almost never write your title as it is listed in full on your website. I will almost never name the endowed chair that you are a part of. I likely won't even ever say you had one. We're trying to get across to the public the very basics of who you are, not all of the things that your funders, that your department would like to have said about you. Your science is going to be simplified, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes, this is part of that process of narrowing things down so that people have one or two ideas that they can really grasp and come away with from a story. And we can't do that if we're trying to pack in every single tiny detail. We're going to simplify things, but we're going to try to do it in a way that gets across as much of the big picture as possible. It's also important to understand that this story is not necessarily going to be told from your point of view. Even if it's specifically about your research paper, I'm going to be looking at ways other people in your field are critical of your work. If it's about a trend or a bigger issue and your work fits in there, your specific ideas might not necessarily be presented as the right ones. And you aren't going to know this going into an interview, because I don't know this going into an interview. If I'm doing my job right, I have to do all of these interviews with a bunch of different people and understand what the big picture is before I understand how your research fits into it. So I can't really tell you what your role is in this story when I talk to you, because I don't know yet. That comes together from talking to a lot of other different people that I'm triangulating with. But I would like you to still talk to me. I think that this is important. But what I want you to do is remember that this is a dialogue, that you have power in a conversation with a journalist. You both want something from each other, and you can ask questions and you can push for things. It's not just about what they want, and it's not just about what you want. It's about what you both want and trying to get to a place where you're both getting something valuable out of the interaction. There are a couple of questions that you should be asking of pretty much any journalist you talk to. And it will probably make you feel better about any interaction with a journalist that you talk to. And I'm going to tell you how I would answer each of these, but those answers can differ based on which journalist you are talking to and what kind of publication they work for and what their specific rules are. So if you ask me if you can check your quotes, I'm going to tell you no. But I will tell you what quotes that I'm using. And if it's completely wrong, we can change it from a quote into a paraphrase or, something that's accurate. I'm just not going to change it and say that it was still exactly what you said, because the rules of my publication are that I can't make up a thing you said. I can't invent a quote just because the thing that you actually said wasn't correct, or you went back and realized it needed a little bit more nuance. We can make that nuance happen, but we can't change the quote to fit the nuance. If you ask me whether you can read a story before I publish it, I am also going to tell you no. Earlier in my career, that was not the case. When I first started out writing, I was doing a lot of work for blogs where I had no editor, and I was still learning how to write about science. And I wanted the scientists to look over what I had written and make sure that I got the explanations correct. But one of the things that I found out that opens me up to is putting me in the middle of other people's academic warfare. And there were many, many times that I would find myself trapped between two people who had been fighting each other in letters to the editor of journals for 20 years, who now wanted to nitpick how I was talking about the other person's research in my story. And that's not a place where I want to be. That is not a situation I want to get into ever again. So I don't show scientists the text of my stories anymore. Sometimes I will ask for specific advice about how to explain a thing, but I'm not going to show you the whole story before it's published. And most journalists won't do that either, for many of the same reasons. We don't want to get trapped between two people who both have legitimate reasons to think the other person's perspective is wrong. Can you be anonymous? Probably not. Most journalists have pretty strict rules about that. What you could do instead, if you don't want your name to be associated with something, is ask the journalist if you can go on background. Basically what that means is that you're introducing me to your field, to an idea, to a set of ideas, to people, giving me all of this information, but you don't necessarily want it to be attributed to you. So what that will do is I will then have to go and find other people who will let me attribute it to them, but I'll have all of this sort of base of knowledge to start working from. So I'm not just going into interviews blind. I'll have a better idea of like what questions to ask and who to go talk to. That's still useful to me. And maybe it can be useful to you if you're in a situation where you don't want your name associated with something. Not everyone will want to do it. People definitely won't want to do it for every story, but it can help a lot, particularly if I'm working on something long. The question of whether this can be off the record, yes and no. You know, if you want the whole thing off the record, if you want to do an interview with me and not be quoted on anything, you know, we can have a conversation, and it'll depend on the story I'm working on and whether that makes sense. If you want to say an aside and not have it end up in the story, I can do that, and I frequently do. I will be in the middle of interviews all the time where people say, I need to say something now that I don't want to be on the record, I don't want to be quoted about, and they'll tell me that little piece, and then we'll go back on the record again, and things will be fine. But you have to ask. I'm not going to check in with you and say, whoa, you just said something really spicy about your colleague. Are you sure you want to make that public? I'm not going to do that. That's a good quote, and I'm going to keep that in case I need it. But if you ask and you say that, most journalists at reputable organizations, like not a tabloid or something, they're going to honor that. So you do need to ask if you're worried. Can I send you questions in advance? Yes, I can, as long as you understand that I'm under no obligation to stick to just that list. Think of it as a help to guide your preparation for the interview and not an absolute list of things that you're going to be asked, because as we're talking, I'm going to come up with new questions. In between the time we set up an interview and when we talk, I'll have talked to other people, and that's going to lead me to new questions. So the list that I send you is not complete. It's a guide. It's not a hard promise. And can you send me a link when it goes up? Yes, I can do that. That's one thing that's completely and utterly open. And in fact, I like you to ask me that, because sometimes I forget to do that at the end of a story. And if you want to know, if you need that information that you participated in media, something you have to share with your department, you might need to ask us to tell you when that thing has been published. All of this stuff is a lot of information, and I realize that not all of it is going to be easily remembered. But if you have it, even if you change a few things based on this, it'll make you a lot savvier. It'll make you a lot smarter. It'll make you more able to get the media experience that actually suits your needs, rather than the media experience that you sort of feel like you just dumped into. So I hope that this is all helpful. And again, if you have any questions, now is a really great time to ask them.
Thank you, Maggie. We really appreciate that. Anybody who has a question, you can post that in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen. While we are awaiting any questions from anyone, I will toss one out to you to begin with, particularly for this audience, and as somebody who interacts sometimes as an in-between point between scientists and journalists, a position of being in between as a public information officer. Can you describe from your perspective as a journalist how you would approach this audience as far as helping them discern what is of interest to a journalist?
Well, that's really going to depend on the journalist. And this is one of the things where I think that it can be useful to know, to like do some research on your own and figure out who is covering your field. Mm-hmm. And go to them specifically rather than mass emails, because what I am interested in is going to be different from what somebody at your city newspaper is interested in. And that's going to be different from what somebody who is early career and writing a lot of articles that are about, hey, this new paper came out. They're going to have different interests. So knowing what the specific journalist does that's a really important part of making it more likely that the time that you spend trying to communicate with us is going to pay back for you. The more that you can have it specific to us, the better. So if you sent me a story about a new paper coming out, unless you just happen to send that to me on the very day that I am writing about that topic, which actually did happen this week. I happened to get a paper on North American bat research and its relationship to COVID safety, literally the week that I was writing about that. But that's maybe the first time that's happened in 5 years. So unless you want to place your bets on that, it's a lot easier to kind of send me things that are, hey, this is this really interesting branch of research I'm working on, and here is the way that it connects to, 3 or 4 things that I see happening in society, or to send me a list of, I'm available to talk about these different topics, and I just want you to know that I am out here. That's useful to me as somebody who writes a lot of big feature stories about a lot of different kinds of topics. For somebody who is writing very tightly on a beat, by which I mean if they write about one specific kind of science and they write about it all the time, they're going to want a different kind of email. It really depends on the journalist. And I think that that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily know. Relatedly, how much experience journalists have with science is also going to differ a lot depending on what kind of journalist they are. I have an undergraduate degree in anthropology, and I have spent 20 years writing about science as a journalist. So I am pretty good at navigating what parts of a scientific research paper to pay attention to, what kinds of questions to ask. I know some of the basic ideas of a lot of different fields. But somebody at your local newspaper, most newspapers don't have science sections anymore. Those things have kind of fallen by the wayside most places. And so you've got somebody who is writing about City Hall one day, and the next day they are turning around and writing about traffic tickets. And then the next day they're getting your press release and writing about your research paper. And they might not necessarily know the right questions to ask. And you may have to guide them a little bit more through this process if you want it to turn out in a story that is actually meaningful and gets across your ideas.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question in the Q&A of, do you select your own topics, or are they assigned to you by publishers for some interviews?
For me, I pick my own topics. I think most journalists do more of picking their own topics than being assigned things. We are usually working with editors to decide whether or not that is a topic we get to pursue. So I go through a process where every week I have ideas and I pitch my editor on them. I try to sell him on thinking that this is important and this is something that our readers need to hear about. But he can veto my ideas, but he usually isn't the one coming up with them. The exception to that is sometimes a big news story will happen, a mass shooting in my case, or something involving the elections, because I'm at 538 and we do a lot of things around that. And they'll say like, hey, we need something on this particular topic because it's a policy question that's going to come up in the debates. And I know that I have to go out and write about that specific topic, but I am really free to decide what the story is, that a topic is not a story. It's just a big broad umbrella, and I can find my own thing under there.
Great, thank you. Do you have any strategies to navigate the narratives from competitive researchers, and I may mispronounce this, like Rashomon, where it's important to keep the connections with the researchers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a very good question. One thing that I have done is make it clear to them that I am incorporating multiple perspectives. I have talked to people and told them, I am talking to this person. I know that you have a very different perspective than this person, but I want to make sure that like I am communicating both of your ideas well. Setting things up that way can be really helpful. It makes sure that they're not surprised, for one thing. And it makes sure that they know that I am not necessarily coming into the situation as a gotcha. You know, most of the time I am not, it's very rare for me to do a story where I know someone is wrong ahead of time and I'm writing a story about how they are wrong. Most of the time I am writing a story where the thesis is, it's complicated. And I try to be upfront and tell people some of that. I think that part of my job as a journalist is to not just take other people's stories, but share my own with them. In so much as I mean that I want to tell them about what I'm doing. You know, if I'm writing a story about your work and I know this is going to be controversial and I know that there is going to be conflict around it, I want to tell you about what I'm finding and what questions I have and try to be fairly transparent about what things I don't understand and what things I am skeptical of. Not all journalists are going to operate that way. I think we have a pretty broad range of how people approach these kinds of delicate situations. But I think that for the most part, the more information that you can give and the more you can think about the situation as a dialogue and not just hoovering up people's information and splurting it out somewhere else, the more you can think of it as a dialogue and a conversation, the better it goes.
Terrific. Thank you. We have a couple more questions that have come in. One is particular to the audience for this conference, notes that in the field of intellectual and disability research, seems to have a little bit less of a presence on Twitter than maybe some other fields such as autism or neuroscience or special education. And because of that, maybe tweets don't seem to go as far, perhaps because the circle is very small. Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions for how these scientists can work together as a group to build a stronger field footprint on social media?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I have sort of found, and this is largely based on my experience trying to build an audience on social media myself, because there's so many journalists on there that it's really easy to just sort of disappear, is to start off by being a participant rather than the subject of the conversation. And what I mean by that is doing searches for people talking about the things that you're interested in and adding them as your friends and following them. Find the people who are having some of these conversations already, find the publications that are talking about these things already, and start following them and start interacting with them. When there's a conversation that you find that relates to your work, have some sort of commentary about it. Retweet it or add your own comment to the conversation. Those things sort of help people see you. And I know the way that I add researchers often is because I will spot them in conversations I'm having, and I'll be like, oh, I really like that perspective. I really think that was interesting, and that story brought something to my understanding of this situation. And so I'll add them, and then I'll see them more often. I think that we often make, and I mean everybody, not just scientists, makes a mistake of sort of hopping into these social media streams and expecting to sort of be the speaker right from the beginning. And sometimes you need to be the participant for a while before you build up the community enough to become the speaker. So that would be my first piece of advice. And then I would just suggest going and reading some of these peer-reviewed studies that have actually looked at how to use Twitter, because there's a lot of people that have done this, and that one that I linked to is not the only one that I found on Google Scholar.
Yeah, I find that encouraging people to seek their community it really helps as far as like looking for those kinds of other scientists they can interact with.
Yeah.
Especially, I think looking at those who maybe they don't agree with too can be
Right.
can be a way
Yeah,
to.
well, and I hate to say it, but like not agreeing with someone is actually a better way to build a following on the internet than agreeing with someone. So, you know, having your own perspective makes you stand out, for better or worse.
Well, to that end, we did have another question, especially regarding some of these forms of media, such as Twitter and TikTok, where only a shortened message, perhaps one without nuance, can be shared. And you know, sometimes there might be a concern with the scientific conclusions being lost in that shortened form.
Yep.
And the writer is concerned that if you're an early career level, this could negatively impact your ability to further your career in academia. Could it be interpreted as scientific misinformation? And so I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
So if you drop me an email, I can connect you with some folks. It's not your same field. A lot of people that I am familiar with who sort of have navigated this over the years have been in oceanography, actually, because a decade ago, oceanography and ocean biology was just had a lot of young early career academics who were really, really interested in social media and blogging, and they were a very active community. And I know a bunch of them, and I know that they had to navigate a lot of these problems, and they had to navigate it at a time when it was even weirder that they were trying to do this. You know, people who had to use pseudonyms for a while and are still often known by their pseudonyms more than their real name in some communities online, even though now they're, you know, their tenure track and they're less worried about it because of that time period, like that their pseudonym has stuck with them as another name for themselves. So I know that this can be a really difficult thing to navigate. I don't have super solid answers for it, but I think that that's another space where participating in the conversation can be safer than leading the conversation. You know, responding to other people's misinformation, clarifying things that you see that are not correct. That can put you in a position where you're being seen and you're building trust with audience, but you're doing so in a way that's not, I don't know, that might be less construed by somebody higher up in your department as trying to make a name for yourself and doing so in a way that miscommunicates.
Thank you. And I would also advise anybody who's with the University of Kansas to this point that there are resources available to help you navigate this as well. People who are very familiar with the challenges sometimes of being succinct and accurate on Twitter. Let's see. One other question I'd wanted to follow up with you as a journalist. What gets you excited about a particular story or angle? How do you know when you are you've found something that you really want to pursue?
This is often a really ineffable quality that is sometimes hard to explain. I think of it as when I start learning things that I get on the phone with my editor, or I am talking to my best friends, and all these interesting facts just kind of start spilling out. That's usually a really good sign that I have a good, longer, in-depth story building. Being able to have a character that I can kind of hang a story on is another thing that I'm often looking for, a character or a specific narrative. So right now, I am working on a story where I wanted to do something about reverse zoonoses of COVID-19. So basically humans transmitting the virus back to animals. And had to kind of do a bunch of interviews, sort of puttering around trying to figure out like, okay, that's interesting. And there's interesting research out there, but like, what's the actual story? And didn't really know what it was until I found out that there was this whole situation over the past year where North American bat researchers were having to kind of have this very scattershot, panicky, shutting down their research, trying to figure out how to do really important research without actually being in proximity to the bats because they didn't really know whether this was something we could transmit back to the bats and what the effect of that would be. Finding that story and that narrative made me able to, I think, tell a bigger story that I'm working on right now. And without that narrative, the bigger story was just kind of like a lot of disconnected facts. So I'm often looking for something to kind of hang the narrative on, whether that's a biography of a person or an animal, as in the case of my story about Pan, the world's most fecund male panda. Or if it is, you know, a beginning, middle, and end narrative of something happened. Those are things I'm often looking for. I am also, I think, looking for, there are certain kinds of facts where I know I don't have to explain very hard why they matter because they're just so interesting that even if you can't really clearly explain why this is important to people's everyday lives, they just want to know more because it's interesting. Those kinds of facts also pop up for me, but I can't tell you how to have those. They just sort of appear. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Sure. I know for every journalist, it's a little bit different how that might work. We do have one more question here in the chat, and then I will ask one follow-up after that if there isn't anything else. This was just proposing, in your opinion, would taking business writing classes improve scientific communication with journalists?
Business writing classes, like, can the question asker clarify what they mean by that?
We'll have to see if they do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm trying to think of like, I think that writing classes generally will help.
In general, yeah.
Yeah, in general will help. Because the more you know about how to craft a story, the more you can tell your own story. I'd almost even say like, take a fiction writing class at your university. And even if you don't ever write anything in fiction that you're proud of, you will come away with a better understanding of like what makes a good narrative. And you can use that to talk about your research.
Absolutely. Help you look at the world a little bit differently and the way the narrative arc can work.
Yeah.
One last question for you. Again, we have a lot of early career and graduate students who are involved with this conference, as well as individuals who are very much further along in their career. And I was curious from your perspective, what is there a difference for you and what makes a good interview with somebody who is much earlier in their career versus somebody who is much further along? And by that, I mean, I hear a lot of trepidation sometimes from early career scientists, again, kind of referring to our previous questioner. They really want to put themselves out there and they understand that value of building that interaction with journalists and that brand for themselves and putting themselves out there, but they're really nervous about it. Whereas some senior scientists may feel they don't have the time of day for a journalist. So I was just wondering, from your perspective, do you run the gamut of it? Do you do you have any advice for early career or graduate students who may be trying to interact with journalists as opposed to somebody who's further?
Yeah, I would say things that you have control over. Reach out to journalists who have a lot of experience, because at this point in my career, I am, old boring journalist and not early career journalist. And I feel like I am at a point now that I can help somebody who doesn't really know how to give a better interview based on the questions that I ask and the patience that I have for them being nervous and just like better listening skills. My skills have evolved to a point where I can do a better job of guiding somebody through that and getting good information out of them. So if you're talking to a journalist and you have control over what kind of journalist it is, go for somebody who has more experience. That is a really good place to start. I think you're probably likely to get into more problems when you have early career journalists and early career scientists sort of matched up together. Then everybody can stumble over their own feet. Understand that it's really normal to be nervous and not know what you're doing. Like, that doesn't mean that you are bad at communicating. That just means that you're new at it. And the only way that you get more comfortable is by doing it. So continuing to avoid talking to people because you're nervous about it isn't going to make the situation better. And if you want to get your research out there, you kind of just have to do it. I think it can also be helpful for people if they have a mentor or they have it doesn't even have to be like the head of your department or anything, but like somebody else that you've collaborated with who has more experience. I can do an interview with both of you on the same line. I can talk to two different scientists at the same time. And that sometimes helps people. That sometimes is really useful. I think that it is also really helpful for me to talk to young early career scientists, though, because often those tend to be like, for lack of a better way to say this, the people that are really high up the ladder are often old white men, and they have a very different perspective than a lot of the younger people of color, women, trans people, all the different people who are bringing their life experience to their research in different ways. And I want to be able to talk to those people, but sometimes they will defer to that older, more experienced professor because they're nervous about it. So, it's something where I understand the discomfort and I understand the fear. And also, I really want to talk to you. So, I wouldn't be contacting you if I didn't. And knowing that maybe helps somewhat too.
That's great advice. Thank you.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank you, Maggie, so much for this great and wonderful talk. And I wanted to thank Jen Humphrey for moderating today's talk. And if you signed up for the pre-conference talk on data visualization, that's happening at 2:00, led by Neda Sadeghi of the National Institutes of Health. And if you did not, then we will see you tomorrow morning at 9:00 Central and hop in for our opening remarks. And anything else, Maggie?
No, I don't think so. Thank you so much for having me. It's very odd giving a talk with no audience reaction. But
we appreciate you doing this.
I hope that those were useful tips. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me a line on Twitter or email, and I can do my best to answer further.
Where can they find you on Twitter?
At Maggie KB1.
Okay.
At symbol.
Great. Thank you again so much. Oh, and also if you are sharing your thoughts about any of the pre-conferences or any of the other conference sessions, you can use the hashtag GatlinburgCon. Thank you again.
Thank you.